The glass hit the marble floor before anyone could stop it. The sound was sharp and sudden, and it cut straight through the low music of expensive conversation in the grand dining hall, a single clean crack, like a gunshot in a room full of people who had been trained never to flinch at a gunshot. 12 women heard it. 12 heads turned, almost in unison, toward the tall corridor door. 12 expressions flickered: surprise, irritation, amusement, calculation, and then, because these were women who had been taught since childhood that composure was a form of currency, every face composed itself again in under 2 seconds. Every face except the one that mattered. Marco Della Torre did not turn his head. He set his wine glass down on the table in front of him, precisely, deliberately, with the unhurried calm of someone who has long since stopped using stillness as a discipline and started using it as a statement. He kept his gaze on the far wall. Not blank, focused, directed, as though whatever he was looking at in the middle distance was more interesting than anything happening in the room around him, which was, in its own way, a communication as clear as any he could have made with words. The room felt it. Rooms always felt what Marco communicated through the things he chose not to do. This was the night he was supposed to choose a wife. The hall itself was magnificent, arched stone ceilings that had survived 3 generations of the Della Torre family, chandeliers that threw amber light in every direction, candelabras placed at intervals down the length of the table in an arrangement that required a specialist and took 2.5 hours to complete. The flowers were winter white, chosen specifically. The crystal was Venetian. Everything about the room had been designed to communicate, in the most legible possible terms, that the man at the head of the table deserved to be taken seriously. That was not actually a message that needed communicating. The 12 women seated along the table had been selected over 3 months of negotiations, background reviews, and inter-family assessments, none of which the women themselves had been directly involved in. Their families had been involved. Their fathers, their brothers, their advisors and legal counsel, and the women who managed their public appearances. The women had been informed of the dinner 2 weeks prior and had spent those 2 weeks doing the only thing available to them, which was prepare, because preparation was the one variable within their control, and each of them was too intelligent not to understand that. They had arrived in their best expressions. Their most carefully chosen silences. Their most practiced versions of effortless grace. Victoria Romano sat 3 seats to Marco's right. She wore a dress the color of midnight, and she wore it with the precision of a general wearing a uniform, not for beauty, though it was beautiful, but for what it communicated about how seriously she took this occasion and, by implication, herself. She had arrived at the mansion 30 minutes early. She had confirmed the table arrangement with one of the household advisors. She had spoken to 2 members of Marco's inner circle before dinner with the relaxed fluency of a woman who considered this outcome a formality rather than a competition. Victoria was 32 years old. Her father's alliance with the Della Torre Empire had been in place for 15 years and had been worth, conservatively, a great deal to both families. Victoria herself had been quietly and deliberately positioned for this specific moment for 8 years, groomed, educated, connected, kept visible in the right circles, kept adjacent to Marco's world without ever being permitted to enter it uninvited. 8 years of patience. 8 years of strategic proximity. She had long since decided, done being patient. She had been speaking, something about a restructuring of investment holdings in the Northern District, framed as casual dinner conversation but researched and prepared over 2 days, when the glass shattered in the corridor. She had recovered without pausing, finished her sentence, smiled across the table at the woman seated opposite her, and then turned, with the unhurried ease of someone performing disinterest, to check Marco's reaction. Marco had no reaction. He was looking at the far wall. Something cold moved through Victoria's chest, a precise, narrow chill, not fear but the specific awareness of a problem that has not yet declared its full shape. She picked up her wine glass and smiled at the room and continued the conversation and filed the cold thing away to think about later. His advisor, Nico Barone, leaned toward Marco's ear and spoke low enough that his voice didn't travel. "The evening is going well, sir. The conversation at the table has been lively. Ms. Romano has been particularly. Has she said anything true tonight?" Marco said, Nico paused. It was a small pause, a trained man's pause, the kind that buys 2 seconds without appearing to. Sir? Anything real? Anything that wasn't prepared before she walked in. Marco picked up his wine glass and looked at it and set it down again. Never mind. He was already standing. The room adjusted in the way rooms adjust around him, conversations breaking off mid-word, posture shifting, every person in the room tracking him with the involuntary and immediate attention that powerful men generate simply by moving in a space. Marco did not acknowledge any of it. He walked toward the tall corridor door with the unhurried certainty of a man who has never needed permission to leave a room in his life, and Nico fell into step 2 paces behind. And the door opened and swung shut behind them both, and the room held its breath for 3 full seconds before anyone spoke. In the corridor, a young woman was on the floor. She was on her hands and knees on the marble, the shattered wine glass spread around her in a wide arc, the fragments catching the corridor light in small sharp points, and she was gathering the pieces with the slow, methodical care of someone who understands that this cannot be rushed. Each shard had to be found. The floor had to be restored. The fact of the accident had to be undone as completely as possible, because the alternative was that the accident remained visible, and a visible accident in this house was a problem she could not afford. Her uniform was pressed. Her dark hair was pinned back at the nape of her neck. She had not heard him step out of the dining hall, or if she had, she was too deep in the focus of the work to act on the sound. Marco stopped. He stood in the corridor and looked at her. Just looked. 3 full seconds of unhurried, unperformed observation. The curve of her back as she worked. The focused economy of her hands. The complete absence of panic or distress or any of the performances of distress. She was cleaning up the mess. That was all she was doing. And she was doing it with the full, collected attention of someone who had decided the mess was going to be cleaned and was now cleaning it, without the additional weight of emotion about the fact of the mess. In his experience, that was rare. He crouched down. He reached for one of the larger pieces of glass near the toe of his shoe, a curved shard about 4 inches long, and held it out toward her. She looked up. Her eyes were dark brown. They were completely unguarded, not performing composure, not arranging themselves into an expression she thought he wanted to see. Not doing the rapid recalibration that crossed every face in the world when people suddenly found themselves in close proximity to Marco Della Torre. She was simply startled. The pure, unmediated surprise of a person who did not expect to find someone crouching beside her. She looked at him the way someone looks at a person, not a position. Not a name that made rooms go quiet. Just a man on the corridor floor with a piece of broken glass in his hand. "I'm so sorry," she said softly. "It won't happen again, Mr. Della Torre." She reached out and took the piece of glass from him. Her fingers were steady. She placed it carefully with the others in her cupped palm and turned her attention back to the floor. He looked at her face for 1 more second. Then he stood and walked back into the dining hall. Nico stood inside the door and watched Marco return to his seat and redirect his gaze to the middle distance and stay there, absent, unreachable, for the remainder of the evening, while Victoria Romano and 11 other women applied every version of themselves they had prepared, and none of it connected, and none of it landed, and none of it reached whatever Marco Della Torre was currently thinking about in the quiet behind his eyes. The dinner ended at 11 without an announcement. Victoria walked to her car. She sat in the back. She said nothing for 7 full minutes, and in those 7 minutes she was very still and very quiet and doing something that looked like nothing but was in fact the controlled, methodical recalibration of a woman who has been surprised and is deciding what to do about it. "Give me everything on the staff in that house," she said finally. Her voice was pleasant. "Every person currently employed there." Her driver nodded. The car moved into the city. Inside the mansion, the candles were extinguished one by one. The hall emptied. The house returned to its nighttime silence, that particular kind of silence that lives in large, old buildings where important things happen, the silence that doesn't mean absence but containment. In the narrow corridor off the east wing, Elena Vasquez sat on the edge of a wooden chair outside the supply closet and looked at her right hand. There was a small cut on her index finger, shallow, already closed, barely worth the name. She pressed her thumb against it anyway and stared at the opposite wall and thought about the moment in the corridor. Not what it meant. She was too careful for that. She thought about the strangeness of it, the specific, unrepeatable strangeness of a man crouching down without ceremony, without calculation, without any apparent awareness of what crouching in a corridor meant in terms of status or optics. In 8 months in this house, she had become very good at reading when people were performing for an audience and when they weren't. That had not been a performance. There had been no audience. It had simply been a man picking up a piece of glass. She stood. She finished her work. She turned out the light. Marco lay awake in the dark at the end of the long hall. The ceiling above him was white and still and offered nothing. He did not think about Victoria Romano. He did not think about 11 other women or the 3 alliances that had been represented at his table or the advisors who would need to be managed tomorrow when the evening ended without a decision. He thought about steady hands. About eyes that had looked at him without fear and without calculation and without any performance at all. He closed his own eyes and let the thought sit exactly where it was, unnamed, until sleep came for him just before dawn. She was awake before the house. Elena moved through the pre-dawn stillness of the Della Torre mansion with the practiced, absolute quiet of someone who had learned long before this job, in the specific and instructive school of genuine danger, that invisibility was a skill worth developing and a discipline worth maintaining. Uniform pressed the night before. Hair pinned at the nape of her neck, no strand loose. The supply cart rolled silently down the east corridor because she had oiled its wheels every month since her first week here, a small and consistent act of self-preservation. A quiet cart meant a clean route. A clean route meant she completed her work before the house fully opened its eyes, and completing her work before the house opened its eyes meant she moved through the first hours of the day without anyone needing to notice her. 8 months in this house. She knew every sound it made. She knew which floorboards carried sound and which absorbed it. There were 7 along the gallery corridor that should be avoided if you didn't want the creak to reach the rooms above, and 2 more on the east staircase that were silent regardless of how much weight you put on them, which was useful. She knew that the second-floor steady light stayed on until 2 in the morning on the nights Marco Della Torre didn't sleep, and that on those nights the kitchen ran out of coffee before noon because he drank it steadily and his staff matched his pace. She knew that Nico Barone took his tea without milk and always sent back the cup for a second without being asked. She knew that Madame Farrow, the head housekeeper, the woman who ran this household with the precision of a legal document and the warmth of a statute, walked her inspection rounds counterclockwise and covered the east wing last, which meant you had approximately 40 minutes of unsupervised time in the west corridor before she appeared. She knew all of this the way furniture knows a room. Through presence without visibility. Through the particular intelligence of the overlooked. In her small room at the end of the service wing, narrow, with a single window that caught 45 minutes of afternoon light before a neighboring structure blocked it, wedged between a linen closet and the utility stairs that served the kitchen, Elena kept 3 things on the nightstand beside her bed. A glass of water, always filled the night before. A worn copy of the Count of Monte Cristo whose spine had cracked years ago and whose margins held faint, careful annotations in her own handwriting, a conversation she'd been having with the book across multiple readings. And a small photograph of herself and an older woman named Rosa, standing in front of a pale yellow house in a place Elena no longer lived and could no longer safely return to, both of them squinting against late afternoon sun, both of them smiling with the particular ease of people who were happy without knowing they were about to stop being. She picked up the photograph every morning before she started work. It was not comfort exactly. Comfort was not something she permitted herself in large quantities, because comfort made you less careful and less careful cost you things. It was calibration. A deliberate act of remembering why she was here, what the rules were, how much depended on her not making mistakes. Then she set it down. Then she went to work. By mid-morning the mansion was fully alive. The formal rooms had been opened, aired, reset. Breakfast had been produced and served and cleared for a staff of 22. The overnight security team had rotated out at 5:50, a time adjusted some months earlier from 6 o'clock. A small change that no one on the security team had been given a reason for, but which Elena had eventually understood was for the benefit of the lead overnight officer, who had 2 young children and a long commute and could, with 10 extra minutes, catch the earlier train. Marco Della Torre noticed everything. That was something people said about him as a form of warning. Elena understood it as fact. She was on her knees polishing the baseboards of the second-floor gallery, a task that required patience and proximity to the floor and produced a particular kind of mental quiet that she had learned to value, when she heard Madame Ferro's footsteps coming up the main stairs. 3 quick, deliberate steps and a half pause at the landing. Elena had memorized that rhythm in her first week. Vasquez. She looked up from the baseboard. Yes, ma'am. Madame Ferro filled the gallery doorway, tall, iron-haired, hands clasped at her waist in their permanent position of contained authority. She had managed this household for 11 years. She had hired 23 staff members in that time and quietly removed 15 of them for reasons that were never formally recorded. She was not a cruel woman. She was precise in a way that could feel like cruelty if you weren't paying attention. "You were in the East Corridor last night," she said. "During the dinner?" "Yes, ma'am." "Returning the extra linen storage to the East Closet?" "You broke a glass." "1 glass. I've replaced it from the household supply budget already." "Mr. Della Torre stepped out of the dining hall during the dinner," Madame Ferro said. Her voice had not changed, still level, still measured. But there was something careful in the phrasing, the way a person is careful when they are conveying information that has weight without wanting to announce the weight directly. "He did," Elena said. "He came into the corridor. He assisted me with a piece of glass, yes." The silence that followed lasted 3 seconds. Madame Ferro steadied her, not what she'd said but what surrounded it, the particular quality of stillness in Elena's posture, the absence of over-explanation. "You are not to make a habit of being visible in spaces where Mr. Della Torre moves," Madame Ferro said, in the careful tone of someone delivering a rule rather than a criticism. "This is not a commentary on your work. It is the operating principle of this household. The staff does not intersect with Mr. Della Torre's world, professional or personal. That separation is a protection. It protects the household's functioning, and it protects you individually. Do you understand what I am telling you?" "I understand completely," Elena said. Madame Ferro held her gaze for one more moment, then turned and walked back toward the stairs at the same measured pace she'd arrived. Elena turned back to the baseboard. Her cloth moved in slow, even circles. Her jaw was tight, she could feel it, the specific tightness behind the hinge, and she held it tight for exactly 3 seconds and then released it, consciously, the way she had learned to release things that could not be acted upon, because acting on them cost more than the cost of letting them go. In the East Wing office on the 2nd floor, Marco sat at his father's walnut desk, a heavy, dark-grained thing that had been in the family for 3 generations and that Marco had kept not for sentiment but because its surface was exactly the right height and its drawers opened without sound, and read a file that Nico had placed there at 8 that morning without comment or explanation. Elena Vasquez. 26 years old. Born in a small coastal town approximately 400 kilometers south of the city. No living family listed. Previous employment: 2 hotel positions spanning just under 2 years, 1 private residential position for 7 months, current position 8 months. No criminal record of any kind. No financial irregularities. No documented connections to any family of standing or significance. No political affiliations. No unusual contacts. Education: 3 completed semesters toward a law degree at the University of the South. Discontinued without formal notice at the end of a semester break. No withdrawal paperwork filed. She had simply not returned. Marco read the law school entry twice. He read it a 3rd time. Then he closed the file and leaned back in his chair and looked out the window. The garden below was bright with late autumn light, the hedgerows geometrically precise, the stone path running its diagonal from the side gate to the fountain, the raised herb beds along the south wall where the afternoon sun collected longest. Moving along that path, carrying a folded bundle of outdoor linen, was Elena. Her head was down. She was moving at her characteristic pace, not hurried, not slow, but purposeful, the pace of someone who has learned that efficiency is a form of invisibility and has decided that invisibility is worth the discipline. He watched her for 40 seconds. Then he pressed the intercom button. Nico. Sir. Why did she leave law school? A pause, small, calibrated. We're still pulling the secondary records. The university's administrative files go back far enough, but the request is pending. Move it to the top. He released the button. He opened the file again and read the law school entry one more time, and the question it contained, the one printed plainly in the ink, sat alongside the other question, the one that existed in the negative space beneath it, the one that no file would answer directly but that he was becoming, against the discipline of 5 years, genuinely interested in. Who was she protecting herself from? Because a woman who dropped out of law school mid-program without filing paperwork, who listed no family, who moved steadily north over 3 years through a series of positions that required nothing of her but competence and invisibility, that woman was not simply someone who had changed direction. That woman was someone who had needed to stop being findable. That evening, Marco altered his pre-dinner route and walked through the ground floor of the house, past the formal sitting room, through the connecting hall, to the doorway of the kitchen. 3 security personnel adjusted their positions automatically. He stopped in the kitchen doorway without announcing himself. Elena was at the far counter with her back to him, organizing the evening service setup. A younger maid worked beside her. Elena said something too low to carry, and the younger maid laughed softly and covered her mouth with her hand. Elena smiled, a real smile, quick and unguarded and entirely different from the careful, measured expression she maintained as her working face, the one that communicated competence and nothing else. This smile arrived before she could arrange it, and it lasted only a second before she turned back to the counter and it folded itself away again. Marco watched her return to focus. He watched the efficiency of her hands. He watched the complete absence, and every line of her, of anything being performed for any audience. He stepped away from the doorway. He went to his study. He sat in the dark for a while without turning on the lights, which was something he did when he needed to think without the weight of the room's expectations pressing on him, and he asked himself, quietly, in the specific privacy of the dark, what does a person look like when they have nothing to perform? He had spent so long in the company of performance that he had almost stopped believing the alternative existed. He was almost certain, tonight, that he had been wrong about that. 5 years ago, Marco Della Torre had stood in the garden of his family estate in late evening light, with a dinner inside being cleared and a ring that had cost him nothing financially and everything else in a box in the inside pocket of his jacket, and he had believed, with the complete, undefended, devastating certainty of a man who almost never believes anything, that he had found something real. Sofia Corelli had been, in the ways the world uses to measure such things, exactly right. Beautiful in the way that required significant effort but completely concealed it. Intelligent enough to match him in conversation without appearing to compete, which was a rarer skill than it sounded. She had laughed at things he said before he finished saying them, which he had interpreted as understanding, as deep familiarity with the way his mind moved, and which he would later understand was preparation. She had asked questions about his thoughts rather than his power, about what he believed and what he doubted, not what he controlled and what he wanted, and in answering those questions he had felt, for the first time in his adult life, the specific and unfamiliar relief of speaking to someone rather than performing at them. He had trusted her. He had done it slowly, over 14 months, the way an old fortification lowers its gate after the same visitor has arrived enough times without incident, the way familiarity compounds into trust and trust, when you are not watching carefully enough, compounds into blindness. Sofia had been working with the Esposito family from the second month. Every conversation in his study where he had lowered his voice and said something true, every moment where he had spoken about the internal architecture of his operations, the decisions that couldn't be explained publicly, the vulnerabilities that he had never articulated to another human being, had been extracted from him with such patience and intelligence that he hadn't felt it happening. She had never pushed. She had never probed. She had simply been present with the full, warm, particular attention that makes a man feel genuinely understood, and the information had moved from him to her to his enemies as quietly and inevitably as water finding the lowest available ground. Nico had placed the evidence on his desk on a Tuesday afternoon and said "sir" and then said nothing else because the documents required no explanation. Marco had read them. All of them. He had not raised his voice. He had not broken anything in the room, though he would understand later that the stillness of those minutes had cost him something, that the energy of the betrayal had not dispersed but compressed itself into something small and cold and permanent in the center of him that would remain there, exactly that size and exactly that temperature, for 5 years. He had said, "Cancel the engagement," in the voice he used for administrative matters. The next morning Sofia Corelli had been escorted from the city with the understanding that her future health was contingent on her future silence, and Marco had returned to his desk and closed the door and rebuilt the wall, faster, higher, more thorough than the one that had stood before it, and had lived behind it ever since with the specific, controlled peace of a man who has accepted a permanent limitation on himself as the reasonable price of not being destroyed again. He thought about all of this now in the early morning quiet of his study because he was doing the one thing the wall existed to prevent. He was paying attention to someone. And not passively. Not the ambient, professional attention he paid to everyone in his world as a matter of operational awareness. Something else, something with direction and warmth in it, something that had been building in the margins of his days for weeks before he had named it, and that he needed to handle carefully, because careful was the only way he knew how to handle things that had the potential to cost him. He needed data. He needed observable behavior over time. He needed to watch how she moved through the world when she didn't know she was being watched, and then when she did, and compare the two. If the person he was beginning to see was real, it would hold across both conditions. If it was performance, it would eventually reveal itself. This was how he had always operated, and it was the one method that Sofia's betrayal had not broken. He left a book on the bench in the second-floor corridor at 7:45 in the morning. Deliberately, there was nothing accidental about it. A worn copy of The Art of War, one he had owned for years, its cover creased and its pages marked in several places. He placed it spine up on the bench at the point in the corridor he knew, from observation, that Elena would pass on her morning supply run. And then he positioned himself at the far end of the hall with a report he was not reading. She came past at 8:12. She stopped at the bench. She looked at the book for a full beat, not the casual glance of someone registering an obstacle, but the particular, slightly slowed look of someone seeing something they recognize, something that has a relationship with. She reached down and picked it up. She opened it to somewhere near the middle. She read. Not scanning, reading, with the quality of attention that slows a person's body as their mind accelerates, that makes them still in a particular way, a held way, the stillness of absorption. Her lips moved faintly over a passage. She stopped entirely for a moment, the pause of someone whom a sentence has just landed on in an unexpected place. Then she set it back on the bench exactly as she had found it, same position, spine up, and continued down the corridor with her cart. Marco waited until she had turned the corner. He walked to the bench. He opened the book to the page she had been reading and found the passage her lips had moved over. Chapter 3. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. He stood in the corridor with the open book in his hands for a long moment and said nothing. Then he walked to his office and sat down slowly and thought about a woman who cleaned floors and read Sun Tzu in the corridor at 8 in the morning and returned the book exactly where she'd found it because it did not belong to her and she had not been given it. And he thought about what that said, not the reading, which could mean anything, but the returning. The precise, unobserved, uncelebrated honesty of putting the thing back because it wasn't yours to keep. That afternoon, Victoria Romano arrived at the mansion unannounced, as she habitually did, on the standing assumption that her access to Marco's world was practically unlimited, an assumption that no one in his household had ever directly corrected because no one made that category of decision without consulting Marco, and Marco had, until now, been indifferent to her comings and goings in the way that indifference communicates permission. She came through the main entrance with the ease of someone who has mapped a space and moves through it with ownership, heading directly toward the main staircase and whatever she intended to accomplish once she reached it. Elena came around the first floor corridor corner at exactly that moment. The collision was nothing, a shoulder meeting an arm, two folded towels dropping from Elena's hands to the marble floor. The brief physics of two people occupying the same narrow space without having anticipated each other. "Watch where you are going," Victoria said. "Not sharp." Sharper than sharp, actually, the tone of someone who has decided the incident is too minor for real irritation and is expressing it at the level of mild inconvenience. The tone of a category distinction. "You are the kind of thing that is in the way." "I apologize," Elena said. She crouched immediately and picked up the towels. Victoria looked down at her, the full, brief, comprehensive look of someone who has assessed an object on the floor and decided it isn't worth picking up, and then stepped around her and continued toward the stairs. Elena rose. She watched Victoria's back for exactly 1 second. Something crossed her jaw, tight, controlled, present for exactly that second and then released, the way she released everything that could not be responded to, and then her face was clear again and she turned and walked back down the corridor. From the upper landing, Marco had seen all of it. He watched Elena disappear around the corner and was aware of something moving through him that was not quite anger and not quite grief and was maybe the recognition of something he had known and filed away for a long time, which was this: the world he had built and operated in for his entire adult life ran on the logic of Victoria's look. On the fundamental, unspoken, universally accepted premise that some people were worth looking at and some people were not. He had operated within that logic his entire life. He had never, before this moment, felt the specific and personal wrongness of it. That evening, at 9:50, he opened the door of his study and found a covered plate on the floor outside it. No note. No knock. Warm to the touch. He crouched and picked it up and looked down the empty corridor. He brought it inside. He lifted the cover. Full dinner, carefully presented, the portion slightly larger than standard, as if whoever had prepared it knew, through observation, that he consistently ate less than he should. He ate at his desk. Alone. As always. But the silence was different. It had company in it somehow. It was the silence of a room where someone had recently, briefly, been thinking of him. He opened her file when he was finished and looked at her photograph for a long time. Then he turned the folder over and wrote on the back of it, "Who are you?" He pressed his hand flat over the words and held it there. Because the thing that was beginning to frighten him was not the question. It was the warmth behind it. It was the fact that he was asking it the way you ask about someone you already care about, with the specific, undefended need of a person who wants the answer because they want to know the person, not because they want to assess a risk. That was the beginning of everything. And it was also the thing he had promised himself, 5 years ago with evidence spread across his desk, never to feel again. The morning Marco made his decision, the house was still dark. He had been awake since 4. He did not often sleep past 4 when something was working itself out in him. His mind had always treated the pre-dawn hours as private workspace, cleared of the day's obligations, useful for the kind of thinking that didn't do well with an audience. He dressed slowly, made his own coffee in the private kitchen off his study because he had never slept well and had years ago adjusted his mornings to account for that, and sat at his desk with 2 files open in front of him in the gray, early light. Elena's file, thin, incomplete, most of its entries still pending, on the left. Sophia's file, full, annotated, retrieved last night from the private archive for the first time in 5 years, on the right. He opened Sophia's from the beginning. Not the operational damage assessments. Not the betrayal documentation. The early entries, the notes he had made himself in the first months, before he had stopped observing and started trusting, when he was still in the business of careful, methodical attention. He had written, "She knows what to say." He had written, "She makes the room feel easy without appearing to work at it." He had written, in a line he could still remember producing, because it had felt like a discovery rather than an observation, "She is always prepared for the questions I am about to ask before I have asked them." He looked at Elena's file. He had written nothing in it yet, had not added a single personal note. There was almost nothing to write, because there was nothing to catalog. No family name being positioned. No wealth being leveraged or networked. No connection to any house of significance. No evidence of any attempt to use proximity to him as a currency. She had not sought proximity to him. Every interaction between them had been accidental on her part and manufactured on his, and in each of those moments her response had been to make herself smaller, not larger, to try to return to invisibility rather than use the moment to establish herself in the room. Sophia had always used the moments. He closed both files. He straightened his jacket. He walked downstairs. He found Nico in the East Corridor at 7:15, mid-morning review with one of the property managers, and interrupted both without apology. "I'm announcing my choice tonight. Inner circle. Informal. Make the calls." Nico looked at him steadily for 3 full seconds, the look of a man taking in information that he has not yet fully processed and is being careful not to respond to before he has. "Tonight, sir. The garden for my coffee this morning." Marco was already moving. "Tell Madame Farrow." He stood in the garden at 6:20 with the coffee and watched Elena in the far corner of the herb garden, cutting stems with a small kitchen knife, working along the raised bed with the complete focus she brought to everything, methodical, economical, nothing wasted. She hadn't seen him. He watched the particular quality of her attention, the way she was entirely present in what she was doing, not performing presence but actually there, the way people are there when they're not managing an audience, and finished his coffee and went inside. He told Nico the name. Nico stood completely still for 4 seconds. The 4 seconds of a man who has learned, through long practice, to contain his reactions. Then, "Sir. She is a member of the household staff. I'm aware of who she is. The Romano family alone, the Ferretti arrangement, the 3 currently active negotiations that depend on this announcement. I've considered all of it." Marco looked at him with the level, final steadiness that ended conversations rather than continuing them. "Make the calls." By 6 that evening, 9 people occupied the formal receiving room, Marco's inner circle, Dante, and representatives from 3 allied families. Aldo Romano, Victoria's father, had arrived in the dark suit he wore to occasions he considered significant, with the broad, composed face of a man who had absorbed difficult news many times and intended to absorb it gracefully again. He did not know yet what the news was. Victoria sat near the front of the room, close to Marco's place, dressed with the enormous precision of someone who had decided what this evening meant and had dressed for the meaning of it. She had prepared remarks, gracious, measured, the remarks of a woman accepting a role she had been too composed to appear to pursue. She had been arranging them in her mind on the drive over, in the satisfied, private way of someone approaching a conclusion they have earned. Marco walked to the front of the room. The conversation stopped. "I've made my decision," he said. The room absorbed those words with the held, focused attention of people whose futures were contingent on what followed. Victoria's posture shifted, barely perceptibly, a fraction of elevation in her chin, a settling of her hands in her lap, the physical language of a person arranging themselves to receive news they have been expecting. She allowed herself, in the space of that 1 second before Marco continued, the private and complete satisfaction of 8 years resolving into a single moment. "Elena Vasquez," Marco said. Silence. Not the brief, functional pause of a room processing new information. A deep silence, the kind that has mass, that occupies the air, that you feel in the chest before you understand it in the mind. The kind that travels through people's bodies because it is too large for an intellectual response to arrive first. Victoria did not move. She did not move for 3 full seconds, and in those 3 seconds every person in the room was watching her peripherally while appearing not to, because the person with the most to lose in a room is always, in the moment of losing, the most informative to watch. Dante was on his feet in 4 seconds. "Brother." His voice was low and very controlled, the voice of someone putting a very large thing into a very small container and applying pressure to keep it there. "Say that again." "You heard me. She is a maid." In this household. She works in the service wing. Yes. You are the head of this family. You understand what this does to the Romano alliance, to everything currently in motion that depends on this announcement going a specific way. I understand exactly what it does. Marco had not raised his voice, had not shifted his weight. He stood at the front of the room with the particular stillness of a man who has already paid a price in his own mind and is simply standing still while the world catches up with him. My decision is made. The room came apart in the controlled, contained, entirely professional way of people whose carefully constructed plans have just been dismantled in a single sentence. Multiple conversations at once, all urgent, all low, all operating at the precise register of people who know better than to shout in Marco Della Torre's formal receiving room. Aldo Romano turned to his advisor and said something too quiet to carry. Dante moved toward Marco with a jaw set for a longer argument than the room was going to allow. Victoria Romano stood. She smoothed her dress once with both hands, deliberate, controlled, the physical equivalent of gathering oneself after impact. She looked at Marco. He looked back at her with the same equanimity he brought to everything, and in that exchange, brief, complete, without a single word, a door closed. It closed from his side, quietly and permanently, and she understood it from hers. She walked out of the room at a measured, unhurried pace that communicated to every watching eye that she had not been diminished. Only redirected. In her car. 40 minutes of absolute silence. Her driver, who had worked for her for 6 years, did not speak. He had learned when silence was required, and this was a silence that was required. She looked out the window at the passing city, and in the stillness behind her eyes she was doing something that looked like nothing and was in fact the full, cold, focused calculation of a woman deciding what comes next. I need everything on Elena Vasquez, she said finally. Her voice was entirely pleasant. Not the employment file. Everything before this house. Every record that exists. Her driver nodded once. The car continued through the city. 40 minutes after the room emptied, Elena stood in the doorway of Marco's study because Nico had come for her. He had found her mid-task in the kitchen prep area, apron on, folding service napkins with the steady, automatic calm of someone who had no idea that her name had just been spoken aloud in a room full of powerful people and had rearranged the temperature of everything inside it. Nico had delivered the message with complete, professional neutrality. Mr. Della Torre would like to see you. No explanation. No context. No preparation. She sat across the desk from him now. Uniform still on. Hands folded in her lap with the stillness she maintained when she could not afford to betray anything. I announced you tonight, Marco said. As my intended. Elena looked at him. She had noticed, in the hour before Nico came for her, an unusual quality in the house, the way energy shifts in a building when something significant has happened inside it, the sound of conversations ending when doors opened, the particular density of movement in the corridors. She had noticed and filed it and not connected it to herself, because connecting anything in this house to herself was something she had learned, with considerable effort, not to do. She connected it now. She felt the connection move through her chest like cold water. No, she said. It left her before the composure could arrive, quiet, instinctive, entirely unmanaged. Marco watched her. No. You need to choose someone else. She stood. Her voice was level, but her hands had pressed together before she rose. I don't have the right family. I don't have the right name or the right connections or the right anything. I'm nobody from nowhere, and your world requires someone who can function in it, someone with standing, someone who can. Why did you leave law school? Marco said. The question dropped into the room like a door closing in a quiet house. She stopped. Marco waited. 5 seconds of real silence. The kind that has weight. Then, lo, that isn't. Why did you change your name? The silence that followed this question was different from all the others. It pressed against every surface in the room. Elena looked at him and something happened in her face, something that was not collapse, not surrender, Something more like the particular and specific exhaustion of a person who has been carrying an enormous thing for a very long time and has just been asked, in the right voice, by the right person, in the right room, whether they might be tired. She was tired. She had been tired for 3 years. "I am not who you think I am," she said. "I know that," Marco said. His voice was quiet and entirely certain. "That is exactly why I chose you." She left his office without answering him. She walked the service corridor with her head down and her hands cold and her mind moving ahead of the rest of her, already sorting, already calculating, already doing the thing it always did when the buried thing came near the surface, which was find the fastest route to containment. She reached her room. She closed the door. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the dark and pressed both palms flat against her thighs and breathed, slowly and deliberately, until the shaking in her chest fell quiet. Her father's name was Augusto Mancini. She had not said it aloud in 3 years. Not to anyone, not to Rosa, who had known him and loved him across the long distance of old friendship. Not to any of the people she had briefly worked alongside in the hotels and private houses of her 3 years of running, not to herself, alone in small rooms in 4 different cities, in the specific, deliberate silence of a woman who has decided that saying a name keeps it present and presence is a form of exposure. She thought it now. She thought it until her breathing steadied. He had been an accountant, methodical, honest, deeply ordinary in most of the ways the world measures men. He came home at the same hour each evening. He made coffee in the same sequence every morning. He believed, with the quiet, uncomplicated conviction of someone who had never been given compelling reason to doubt it, that an honest life was sufficient protection against the larger, darker violences of the world. He had believed this the way people believe things that have always been true for them, not as a principle held against evidence, but as a simple experienced fact. He had been wrong. But it had taken them time to show him. The company he worked for, an import and logistics firm, established, mid-sized, with offices in 3 cities, was a front operation. Clean on the surface, meticulous enough to pass routine scrutiny, but structured to move money that couldn't be moved through legitimate channels and to document cargo that wasn't what the documentation said it was. Augusto Mancini had been their accountant for 3 years before the numbers began to tell him things he hadn't been meant to know. Not all at once, gradually, the way a discrepancy reveals itself to someone patient enough to keep looking. A figure that didn't reconcile. A shipment whose costs didn't match its listed contents. A pattern, when you looked at enough entries across enough months, that didn't fit any legitimate explanation. He documented what he found. He was thorough and he was careful, and when he was certain, he contacted a government attorney and began building a formal file. The company belonged to the Ferrari family. They found out about the attorney in less than 2 weeks. They had people everywhere. They always had. Augusto Mancini was found at the bottom of a staircase in his office building on a Wednesday morning. The fall, the official record stated, had been an accident. Elena was 23 years old and in the 2nd month of her 1st semester of law school when she received the call, and she knew, with the cold, flat, nauseous certainty of someone who has spent enough time around the truth to recognize its opposite immediately, that the official record was a functional lie. She went to the police 3 times over 2 weeks. The 3rd visit, she came out of the precinct building and a man she had never seen before was standing on the pavement across the street. He had said nothing. He had done nothing. He had only looked at her, a long, still, completely deliberate look, and then looked away. She had stood on the steps of the precinct and understood, without any ambiguity, that the looking was the message. That she had been seen, and that being seen meant she was no longer safe. She packed a bag that night. She left the city on the first early bus. She became Elena Vasquez by the end of the week, not a difficult thing to arrange, if you know the right edges of the world to work in, and she had moved north steadily, through hotels and private houses and carefully. Unremarkable work, until she reached the city and found a position in the household of Marco Della Torre, who was the Ferrari family's oldest enemy and their most dangerous one, and who ran the one house in the city where they would not, logically, be looking for someone they wanted to find. She had not come here for justice. She had not come here for rescue. She had come here because she was exhausted and afraid and needed to stop being findable, and this address was the best cover available to her. She had kept her head down and done her work and made herself invisible for 8 months, and she had been successful, and she had known it would not last indefinitely, but she had hoped for longer than this. She lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow she would tell him. Not because she had decided to trust him, trust was still something she was computing the cost of. Because he was already asking the right questions, with the specific, patient certainty of a man who asks questions he already intends to answer, and a file with her real history on it was going to arrive on his desk before the week was out regardless of what she chose. Better her words, on her terms, than his discovery on his. She closed her eyes. She did not sleep. 3 floors above her, Nico placed a folder on Marco's desk at 11:47 and said, "The full history. On Vasquez." Marco opened it and read the real name first. Then the father. Then the company, its structure, its ownership, the Ferrari family's connection. Then the whistleblower contact, the attorney's name, the timeline. Then the death, the official record, and below it a secondary document from a source Nico had cultivated over years that told the real version in 3 sentences, matter-of-factly, the way people in certain professions record certain kinds of facts. Then the police visits. Then the departure, sudden, total, no trail left. He read it once completely. Then he read it again slowly. Then he closed the folder and was still. He thought about 8 months of a woman keeping herself invisible in the house of her father's killer's oldest and most powerful enemy. He thought about what that required not in theory but in practice, in the specific, unglamorous, daily discipline of waking before the house and oiling a cart's wheels and keeping a face composed and releasing a jaw tightened by insult because releasing it was the only available response. Survival, he understood, was mostly this, the accumulation of small, unwitnessed disciplines. He had operated in his own version of it for 5 years. He picked up the folder. He walked to the service wing. He knocked on her door. She opened it almost immediately, and that fact, she had not been sleeping, moved through him quietly. She looked at the folder in his hand. She did not look away from it. "How long have you known?" she asked. "An hour." She held his gaze. "And now?" He held out the folder. She took it. She opened it and looked at the contents without flinching, not because the fear wasn't there, but because she had already lived through the worst of this and what remained was only the truth, and the truth, whatever else it was easier to hold than 3 years of keeping it concealed. "Your father told the truth," Marco said. "And they killed him for it." "Yes. You have been living inside my house, inside the house of their oldest enemy, for 8 months. I wasn't here for strategy." Her voice was quiet and direct. "I was here because I was tired. Because I needed somewhere they wouldn't look. That is the whole of it." She looked at him steadily. "I didn't come here for rescue. I know that." Something came through his expression then, not a performance of something, not the managed presentation of an emotion chosen for its effect. Just the thing itself, the recognition of a person who has been carrying something alone for a long time, visible on his face without his having arranged it there. "I'm not going to hurt you. You don't know me well enough to promise that. I know you better than you think I do." She was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Why me? With everything your choice costs, the alliances, Dante, everything in motion, why?" "Because you are the only person in this house who has asked for nothing from me." His voice was even and certain. "You brought my coffee the right way without being told. You left dinner outside my door without asking for anything in return. You read my book in the corridor and returned it exactly where you found it because it wasn't yours and you knew it. In a world where everyone is performing something, performing loyalty, performing love, performing every version of themselves they think I want to see, you have only ever existed. You have taken up exactly the space you needed and no more. That is the rarest thing I have ever witnessed." He paused. "I am asking you to stop hiding. Victoria Romano's move came before dawn. She had delivered Elena's real name and the Ferrari connection to their representatives by 3 in the morning, a woman's location passed to the people who had killed her father, executed not from knowledge of what it would mean but from the cold, focused calculation of a woman who had been humiliated at a dinner table and needed to restore the balance. By 5:50, 2 Ferrari vehicles had been observed at the outer perimeter of the Della Torre property. Nico had the full security deployment active in 11 minutes. Marco came downstairs with the controlled urgency of a man for whom crisis was not an emergency but a state of operations, something managed, not panicked. He found Elena in the kitchen, mid-task, because routine holds when everything else becomes uncertain and her routines were deep. She turned when he came through the door and read his face in the 1 second before he spoke. "They know where you are," he said. She set down what she was holding. Both palms flat on the counter. One slow breath. "How long do we have?" "My people are already at the perimeter. They will not get inside this house. You can't maintain a full security posture indefinitely over." "Elena." The word was quiet. Final. It was the voice he used when a conversation needed to end, not because he was dismissing it but because there was nothing more to say. "Stop finishing that sentence." She stopped. 3 days later, they were married in a small chapel 40 minutes outside the city. Dante was there. Nico was there. Rosa had driven through the night. Elena had called her at 2 in the morning and Rosa had said "I'm coming" before Elena had finished the sentence, because Rosa was that kind of person and had always been. She stood in the second pew with her hands clasped and her eyes very bright, and when Elena came through the chapel door Rosa said nothing at all, only nodded, the slow, full, complete nod of a woman who has been watching someone she loves survive for a very long time and is watching them, at last, arrive somewhere. Elena wore ivory. Simple, unadorned, nothing designed to declare anything to anyone. She walked the short aisle without performance, without ceremony, without the specific and exhausting work of a woman trying to prove she has earned her place. She walked it the way she had always moved when she wasn't hiding, directly, purposefully, taking up exactly the space she needed. Marco watched her walk toward him and felt the last calculation in him go still. His vow was not long. "I have spent 5 years treating every person in my world as a variable. You are the first person who made me feel like I was the one being measured, not for what I could offer, but for who I actually was. In a corridor with broken glass between us, you looked at me and you were not afraid and you were not calculating and you were not performing anything. I have spent my entire life surrounded by people who were performing everything. That singular absence, your complete and unmanaged realness, has done more to dismantle what I built to protect myself than anything in 5 years. He held her gaze. "I am finished building walls. I am asking to stand beside you, wherever that leads, for as long as you will allow it." Elena took a breath that was not entirely steady. "My father believed that an honest life was the only life worth protecting. He died for that. For a long time I understood that to mean honesty was dangerous, that it was a liability, not a value. But I think what he meant was that it was rare. And that rare things are worth the cost of protecting them." She looked at Marco, fully, directly. "You saw something in me before you knew what it was and you protected it anyway. I do not take that lightly. I will not." The officiant spoke. The words settled into the small chapel the way quiet settles, completely, in every corner. Outside in the thin winter light, Dante stood beside Marco in the courtyard and watched Elena laugh at something Rosa said, a real laugh, unguarded, thrown back, the laugh of someone who has stopped checking the exits. Dante was quiet for a long moment. "I was wrong about her," he said. "I know," Marco said. Within the week, Victoria Romano's connection to the Ferrari family was fully documented and delivered to the appropriate parties. Her father, 20 years of alliance with the Della Torre name behind him, disowned her quietly and completely to protect what remained of his own position. Victoria was left with nothing she had gambled and nothing she had started with. She had looked at Elena and seen a maid. She had not seen what Marco had recognized from a corridor floor with broken glass between them, a woman who had survived everything designed to destroy her without losing the particular, rare, irreplaceable quality that made her worth choosing. They returned to the mansion as evening fell. The lights came on in the tall windows one by one. The house was the same house it had always been, same marble, same dark corridors, same rooms full of history. Elena walked through the front door instead of the service entrance. Nobody said a word. If this story held you from the first scene to the last, if you felt every silence, every shift, every moment where something changed between these two people, then you already know what this channel is built to do. Subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a comment and tell us which moment hit you the hardest, Marco's vow, Elena opening her door at midnight, or that final walk through the front entrance. Share this with someone who needs a story today. And hit the like button so more people find their way here. We will see you in the next one.